Hey, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking to help us multiply engagement and loyalty. I'm Rob Alvarez, a consultant and the founder of Professor Game and a professor of gamification and games-based solutions at IE Business School, EFMD, EBS University, and other places around the world. And before we dive into the interview, if you're struggling with engagement in your business and are looking to find out how to make sure your users stay with you, perhaps you will find our free gamification course useful. Find it for free in the links in the description. Hey engagers, and welcome back to another episode of the Professor Game podcast. And today we are with Drew. But Drew, we need to know, are you prepared to engage?
Yes.
Let's do this. Let's go. Because Drew is a professor, producer, and player of interactive media, and he has a background through academic, industry, and professional worlds. And he is interested in stories and transformational experiences across text, comics, games, and other media, where he explores arts, design, and science of making media that matters, working to expand our notions of what media are capable of doing and what we're capable of doing with media. He's an expert in leading creative collaborations with interdisciplinary groups, orchestrating change and building initiatives focused on making positive social impact. And he is a teaching professor at the Entertainment Technology Center at Carnegie Mellon University and is the founder and editor-in-chief of Play Story Press, an open community publishing consortium, as well as a well-played series and journal. So a lot of stuff going on at this point, right? Anything we're missing from that intro that we should know before we go on?
I think I got the high notes for sure.
That's good. That's good. So you mentioned in the pre-interview that you're on a sabbatical right now. So maybe now, maybe from before, or maybe what are you planning to have as a regular day once the sabbatical ends, or right now? We want to sort of be in your shoes for a bit, just to have a feel of what the stuff you're doing looks like.
Yeah. So I'll start with sabbatical, and then kind of like on the sabbatical, it's this wonderful sort of like a chance as a professor to spend a lot of dedicated time doing a project. And so what I was doing is I had this idea to do a study, just talking to people from all around the world, from a variety of fields, just anybody who felt like their work, their interest, their life related to play. And so that's just been inspirational, just talking to a variety of people through there, from like musicians to athletes to, of course, game designers and, academics who are curious in games and play, and child psychologists who do play therapy, and, just this huge range. It's made, people out of theme parks. It's been really fun. So like a normal day is sort of like there are a couple places where I have colleagues where I have been hanging out at museums and at office, tech offices and media companies here in town, just to like chat with people and be around stuff, and also just to do work. But I've done a lot of sitting down on Zoom, because I was using Zoom just to help record and transcribe the interviews. So a big part of that is just sort of like doing the interviews and then reading them and things like that. And then more broadly, as I, am back into like the more normal part of my life as a professor, spend a lot of time on like getting in, chatting with colleagues. Like the Entertainment Technology Center is very project based. So it's a graduate program. For those of people who might not know, it was, goodness gracious, it's almost 25 years old. I've been around like 22, 23 years now. And it was founded out of Carnegie Mellon's Computer Science and College of Fine Arts. One of the founders was Don Marinelli out of Drama and Fine Arts, and the other was Randy Pausch out of Computer Science, who got somewhat famous for his last lecture that a lot of people have seen. If you haven't seen it, it's a very inspirational talk, and I highly recommend you get on YouTube and find it. It's really well done. And Carnegie Mellon just did a remaster, so the quality's been really improved from the talk. It's like 15 some odd years ago now. So anyways, that context is like we have grad students from all over the world coming in there, programmers, artists, designers, musicians, people with business backgrounds. We put them together on teams and they make things. So a big part of faculty members' day there is meeting with the students as individuals, but also these project teams that might be working on something for a client externally, whether it's for-profit, nonprofit, or based on research. Or could be their own idea, pitching it, or a faculty's research idea as well. So you get together and the sort of head fake, Randy talks a lot about head fakes in his last lecture, is it's less about what they're making and more about how they're making it. And so it's really easy for us as people to kind of go, okay, what's the game or the virtual reality experience or the thing on mobile? And that is an artifact that, they're going to get graded on and looked at. But what we really care about is like the process that they go through to make it together. So the big part of it, is sort of like, all right, you're working with people and that can be challenging and you'll have different opinions and different ideas and people can suck. And so like, that's almost like the universal thing is like, if you've got a group of people working together, there's going to be communication challenges and opportunities, just scheduling, people caring about different things, a client who just doesn't like what you're doing. So all of that together is a big part of what we help sort of support the teams and students through, is how to step up as professional and assume responsibility for their role on these teams. And if you're doing creative work, I always like to say, you don't really know the end result. I mean, if you know exactly where you're going and how to get there, then I'd say you're not doing anything creative at all. And so it's, as they sort of try to figure out and iterate through ideas and play test with, demographics and focus groups just to see how it's going. That's a big part of what we do, is meet the teams. And then, stuff like just a lot of times the email, a lot of meetings, a lot of chatting with colleagues, looking at both colleagues who are in other schools or around Carnegie Mellon and ways that we can collaborate and talking about things we're doing together, to colleagues out in the industry, whether it's to help talk about students or what's going on in the industry and help them, hire students, or, think about ways that they can learn from how we do the stuff we do and vice versa. We're very open and interested in talking to the industry and seeing what's going on and how that can be folded into our curriculum so that our students have as close to a real world context within the, boundaries of being an academic program. And then a big part is, I'm sure you're familiar with this and a lot of the listeners, is like you attend events, whether it's a conference or a festival. And so it's a big part of like thinking about I've had 2 meetings this week on 2 different conferences or festivals, just sort of like as people are like, well, what can we do and how do we pull together an event that people would want to pay to attend? So that's a lot of meetings. It's definitely white collar work where I spend a lot of time on a computer and a lot of time in front of a screen. But then it's really fun to get hands on with all these project teams and stuff and get out and about and see what other people are doing. That's really inspiring.
So let's take it from there. Actually, those creative teams, when involving, again, as you were saying, play and that kind of stuff in your work, we would like to be on a story with you. Actually, a concrete story. You don't have to name any names.
Okay.
No shaming is necessary. It's welcome, but it's not necessary anyway. Where things actually did not go your way. So it was what we'd like to call a first attempt at learning, or a fail moment. We want to be there with you. We want to take any lessons we can take. That kind of stuff.
Trying to think of a good one. There's so many failures. I think, one project I really liked because it ended up being a really powerful success was we were doing a collaboration with a group out of New York City called the Theater of War. And long story short, they do performative readings of classic Greek tragedies. At least initially, they did it for soldiers. They've also done it now for like medical professionals and stuff. And the idea was being exposed to these, wonderfully powerful, overly emotional stories being read by professional actors and actresses would get them to be the starting moment to sort of see that and experience that, and then afterwards have a facilitated discussion around the themes that were in the piece, in the tragedy or something. And they were finding that it really helped soldiers unlock and talk about their PTSD in ways that they might not have prior. And so they came to us. We were sort of chatting about a collaboration, and one of the biggest challenges they were facing is like, well, about the biggest group we can do this for is about 150. So it's really hard to scale. And there's so many people that could benefit from it. So they're thinking about ways to make it scale. So at first, we were working, the team and the client and the Theater of War were working, thinking about, well, maybe virtual reality. And this is 10 plus years ago now, to just when like the Oculus was coming out with their headsets publicly, and they were available. So just to give you a sense of the quality. And so they were like, well, maybe headsets, because then you could watch it and you'd feel like you were there. And that, and that way we could sort of scale and just send people out. And as they were sort of play testing, and it got a lot of traction because headsets were kind of coming back, and everybody's like, okay, VR, here's the next wave of it. And two things that sort of came out that were sort of like the failure part of it was, well, one, it's at the time, and it's still, people need to have a headset. So not everybody has a headset. Even, it hasn't really broke big where like everybody has a smartphone. Not everybody has a headset around. So there was a bit of that of like, oh, how do we get things to people? And that would require money and maintenance and some IT expertise and stuff like that. So there was some adding in. And then the other thing they started thinking about as we were exploring the idea initially was like, well, they kept talking about how the powerful thing was the conversation after the performance. And that's at the time, it was like, well, there's not much social happening in VR. And so it feels like you're trying to have a facilitated event where then they take the headsets off so that somebody's helping do the discussion, or, at the time it was like networked online multiplayer and a headset's not happening really well. And even now it's still like kind of there. And then the pandemic happened, and it's like, whoa, how do we feel like we're sharing space together? Our headsets the way? How do we, everybody was trying to crack that. So the team started pitching it. So we were kind of getting down to where like, this might not be the answer. It doesn't look like VR is going to work. And there was a lot of investment just because it seemed like an idea there. And at the time there was like, well, there's grant money around mental health and well-being that maybe if we attach it to a headset, it's sort of like it's technology for medical. But the team pitched them this idea of like, well, they kept talking about how conversations were so important. So they pitched them a board game that they could play together. And it would be a board game that had an app associated with it, a smartphone app. So Android or iPhone. And the idea was the readings would still be performed, but they would be recorded on the app. And then the app would help them then play this game around the board where they got to they did this clever job with the mechanics. So you'd listen, and then there's these ways that as you were moving around the board, it encouraged you to discuss what you had heard, or you would get tokens to like be able to pass if it made you too uncomfortable, or like tokens to even, oh my God, this is so powerful, but I want to second what that person said, like amen to that. And so you could like lay down a card to like sort of like double down on the sentiment expressed. And so like out of this idea of like, oh God, we're going down this alley that doesn't seem to work. All of a sudden this left turn of like, well, maybe it's a board game, because if you're sitting around a table, you're naturally going to talk. And if you put it on the app, you can have a lot of, instead of having to have an expert and a programmer there, or, an expert facilitator there to make sure the conversation's happening, the app could really help guide the discussion with prompts. And it just took off, and we were all sort of crazy surprised by how well it went. And so that's like, part of it's just like iterating. And that's the thing, like I was saying at the top, if you're doing something creative, you might not know what you need to do while you're in the process. And so it's like,
and that's something I love.
Ideas.
I love about that story, right? It's failure, as we've discussed many times on the podcast. Fail is not final. It's not fatal. It's not the end of the world. It's just you hit a dead end and you turn back and look at what are other options, what are other roads you can take to achieve this, because you're in love with solving a certain problem that you guys have. Right. And the beauty of this is you not only got there and got to a point where, we were standing on top of the wave of the trend of VR at the time, right? And then you said, look, this is not the answer, right? We're going back to something else. We're going back to board games with apps. Apps have also been around for quite a while. So fantastic. I love that story. Thank you very much for sharing that, Drew. And I don't know if you want to stick to that one or go into something else where, things eventually became a success, right? This one is evidently a story of success, as you were sharing. We want to, again, be there with you and perhaps look at some of the success factors that might have been present in that situation.
Yeah, I think like getting at what you're saying, like how failure is not final or fatal. One of the things all of our students do is they're required to go through improvisational acting before they get on these semester-long projects like this. And nice. It came out of the genesis of the program. And it was inspired by Ed Catmull from Pixar. When Don and Randy were starting up the program, they were visiting people in the industry going, all right, we want to do this thing. It's going to be geared towards the creative industries. So it's, the ETC rewards a master's in entertainment technology. It's helps us tell people what we're not. It's like, oh, it's not a technical degree. That's a master's of science. It's not an MFA or fine arts, and you're not just writing papers like an MA. And it's kind of like an MBA. It's focused on the industry, whereas MBA is more, management and finances were the design and development. And so they were visiting companies, and they visited Pixar, and Ed Catmull was like, have everybody take improv, because they'll have to check their egos at the door. And it really helped from his perspective. What he was pitching was really helps, teams, become closer and more open and trusting of each other. And so they develop a respect and so they got a professor, her name is Brenda Harger, and she'd be great if you want to interview somebody who's fun. So she's taught this class for the entirety of the existence of the program, where everybody goes through, and it's not about becoming a better actor or actress. It's about that whole yes and philosophy and the paradigm of thinking about how you share credit and share ideas and build on these things together, like making your partner look good. And we hope it would translate outside of the class, where they're doing things in a room together, and when you're up on stage trying to improv with somebody, it's visceral if things are going well, or if things are like, oh my God. But we hope it then kind of like translates forward. It's like, with improv, it's like serve the narrative. What makes the story go well? How do you yes and what's going on? And then how does that translate into, I'm working on a project where they have these goals, i.e. the narrative. And how do we, keep trying to do different things? So hopefully that gets people into a mindset where they're very open and comfortable, kind of go, well, let's try this. Well, let's try this. And let's try this, and not get locked in and you kind of feel like, well, I have to hang on to this idea because we've already started, as opposed to like, well, the idea's not working. Let's try something new. And really try to support each other through it as they work their way through the process.
Nice improv for getting people to move around, and also it's like the two things, right? You're getting two things together. It's about just coming up with things, but it's also coming up with things together. It's you're respecting the rest of the people in the room, which is great. One of the things I love to do, and it was almost over 2 years ago that we underwent the Lego Series Play training, right? One of the objectives is precisely that. Like, everybody in the room has a say, because it's part of the methodology. Like, there's no way you don't have a say in what's going on, right? And that's a clever way as well to do it through fine arts, as you were saying before, right? Love it. Thank you for sharing that as well, Drew. And if you were to come up with a solution for a problem like the ones you've been discussing, right? You mentioned before the one that this solution that they were doing of, performing plays and then having these discussions. So things that you would like to solve through, call it playfulness, game design, creative solutions around these concepts, whatever you want to call it. Do you follow some method? I mean, I'm guessing that when you teach them, it's like, well, do these things, and at least you have a shot at not the results, right? But how does maybe thinking about this get you to move forward in some direction, at least?
Yeah, there are a couple things. Like, one of our professors is Jesse Schell, who runs Shell Games, and he has a really great game design textbook, The Art of Game Design. Similarly, we also have an alum named Sabrina Selba, who's written a book called The Transformational Framework. And a great, like, Jesse's book is game design writ large and really working through the process. And it's great. It has a deck of cards along with it to help it make a very playful experience as you work your way through sort of like the foundations of how to think about game design. And then Sabrina's book, The Transformational Framework, does a great job showing you what you should consider if you want to do something educational, or have some sort of what we would call transformational impact above and beyond just, I played it and enjoyed it. So whether that's educational or like civic engagement, or just raising awareness, or medical. And so for us, that's sort of like getting the team to start thinking about things implicitly from the start, with all the stakeholders involved. Like, there's like that classic sort of waterfall model of like, somebody's got some funding and they want to fund, games to help kids not start smoking. I'm totally brainstorming, and they're like, well, we need to find people who know make games, and we need some academics who can help do the studies. And you sort of work your way down, and then it's like, okay, now we're going to get the game in front of kids. And sometimes like the kids are getting like soaking wet at the bottom of the waterfall from everybody's good intentions as they work their way down. And we find it's much more better from the start to be really co-creative and get everybody together. So it's like, it's a game for kids that you want in school. You better have teachers on board so they understand, because they're the ones who's going to make it happen or not. Like, we've done some projects with school districts where it was like the superintendent and the principal were like, we want to do this. And the teachers were like, oh God, something else. Our jobs are hard. And you're giving us something that's going to be a burden on top of everything else. And so it took time, like almost a whole year of just sort of like really being transparent and upfront about, no, we're only going to do this with you. And if it doesn't happen with you, it's just not going to happen. And the same token, even though the teachers were kind of like if it's going to be in a school district, the teachers are going to make it. It's the kids that are going to be playing it. So we're play testing it a lot with the students, whether it's K through 12 or, somewhere in that range. So it's like getting their input to make sure you have it, aged appropriately, scaffolded appropriately for their, like one time we had a team doing, something for, I think, first to third grade. And they were trying to use iPads or like a Android pad. And they found out like first graders, the pad was just heavy enough that it was tiring for them to hold it while they were standing up. And third graders didn't even think about it being tiring. So it was just even that close to age range, just developmentally, there was that weird little thing of like, oh, we're doing it on iPads. Oh, they're getting tired. So they're putting the iPads down and not using it. And so it's like that kind of like get everybody together and then really start working. Like we really preach play testing. It's like paper prototyping, thinking of your ideas, brainstorming, like building on that improvisational paradigm of like, yes-anding the ideas together as you work your way together and like pitch your idea to client or the faculty or, and always inevitably we'd have like some team that'll be like, oh my God, we had the wrong students who came and tested our product. We need better students. And we're like, well, it's not their fault. Some, user you were testing and they don't get it, really try to learn from that because it's not because they were the wrong people. You can get a lot of useful stuff out of it. And so we try to help our students understand that can be generative, like lead them towards the next better idea as opposed to, I have to stop and do everything all over. So really trying to get them comfortable with that idea of like iterating, collaborating. And then like, on the one hand, it's really powerful. On the other hand, every other person in the mix is another level of complexity. It's like, so we're talking to the teachers, and it's an after school thing. So parents want to weigh, parents are going to care or something, and it's like, let's get all those in. It's, somebody's funding it. Well, we need to pass something that the funder goes, oh, yay. I'm glad that did something useful in the world,
Totally.
And then there's always somebody who's like, can you make it green? Why is it blue?
It's part of the feedback, right?
Right. So that's like really being open and like weekly meetings, regular meetings, hash it out. Anyways.
No, and having everybody already on board, these multidisciplinary teams, it's something that's talked about maybe a bit too much for how much it's actually being used, in my opinion, in my experience at least. But seeing that you're some of the ones who are pushing people back into the industry, right? After this, hopefully it's, part of that generating force where this kind of thing will be more and more common ground, right? So where you're really thinking about this. I remember working, many years ago in Procter & Gamble, and there was these multidisciplinary teams all that long ago, and it was working like really well. I don't know if they're still doing it or not, but it worked really, really well. I'm just surprised that we're still like talking about it as this something that is sort of innovative, right? And not implementing it as much as possible. And again, not to say Procter was this great thing. It's just they did it. It worked. I'm sure they talked about it, right? Everybody knew that they were doing it. Like what are other, companies, organizations waiting for this kind of approach? But good, great to see that you're part of that as well. And Drew, is there any sort of this like that kind of tip or, not silver bullet for sure, but that thing where you say, well, if you do this when you're making your creations or these projects, it'll be at least a little bit better if you, I don't know, think about it this way, or always do play testing, for example. That's like a bit generic, but like if you do this thing, maybe it's always going to be at least a little bit better, right? Sort of a best practice, maybe.
I like, it kind of reminds me, there's a book I read somewhat recently called Thinking in Bets. And it was just about how, we live in uncertainty. And, and the woman, she's a professor, I think she's in Pennsylvania. I'm not sure where she's based right now. She might be at Duke. Anyways,
I think I've heard that book recently, and she was a poker player or something like that.
Yes, exactly. So she was using poker as a lens to think about uncertainty and ways to make smart decisions when you're really kind of, you're making decisions based on not having all the information involved, but a lot. And a great point that came out of the book is that like you can go through the good process and still lose and still fail. But the good process in general is what's going to keep you having successes across time. And a big mistake that we make, humans, will be like, oh God, we hired the wrong CEO. We did it wrong. And they're like, no, you did everything right. Just happenstance, you got a CEO who wasn't a fit. And so it's like having the comfort to keep committing to like, okay, let's try, like, okay, it's not working, but we'll play test, It's like I was saying, it's like the how you do it becomes really important. So like you're supportive and engaged and discussing, as opposed to, well, I'm just going to take over and tell everybody what to do because I can solve it. And then the next thing you know, that it might work that time, but then it's become less of a collaborative thing and more about there's somebody who's obviously the boss. And, and a lot of people joke / it's just a fact of life of anytime you're in the creative industries, whether it's making games or films or, there's the people who are doing the creative work and the people who really care about budgets and spreadsheets and staying on time, and that, like the tensions therein of, I need this to hit by the holiday season and it better be big, like Sony just had that huge thing where the game, I'm blanking on the name. It starts with this C, the game they just had to pull after just like 4 or 5 weeks, but they were hoping it would be like the next iteration of something that would be as popular as Star Wars. And it just kind of fizzled. And but everybody who did the work on it, they did just as much work as somebody who did work on a project that went well. It takes just as much work to make a bad game as it does a good game or successful game, as opposed to a game that doesn't quite click.
Totally. And Drew, you've started on with recommendations. How about, is there, a person that you would like to listen to or see on an interview like this one, answering these questions, giving these recommendations, somebody that maybe makes you curious to see what their thoughts are on these things?
There's some of the people I mentioned I just know so well and I think very highly, like, the professor who does improv, Brenda Harger's amazing, Jesse Schell's really dynamic speaker, Sabrina Silva's brilliant. They're all great. And I was trying to think of people who I'd love to hear. Like, I think it's really interesting in this type of context of like, okay, here's what this podcast is and here's what we're trying to do. Like my wife and I were just talking the other night on PBS here stateside. We watched something called The Expressway, starring Dule Hill, the actor. And it was really focused around arts and activism in marginalized, underserved, underrepresented communities, diverse, and it was just inspiring and amazing. And so I love stuff like that, where you find somebody. It made me think a lot about how I'd want to think about doing interactive game type work differently, or, topics I could tackle or things like that, ways we could do it. And so like, sometimes it's fun to like, could we go outside our, current community and find somebody that might bring some ideas in that surprise us in ways that would really get us going in new ways. It can be fun just as much as, I can guarantee Jesse Schell would be a good interview,
Totally. And in fact, Jesse Schell is a past guest. I have to check exactly which episode it was, but he was around episode 100. I'm not exactly sure if it was actually 100 or it was close to that, but actually, let me check it here. He was episode 102, in fact.
Yeah, there you go, right?
Jesse Schell. Totally. Great, fantastic guest, fantastic book. And in that sense as well, maybe you have a book. Well, the many that you've mentioned that you would like to recommend are engagers, as we call them.
I feel funny. I'm so old fashioned because I like to read so much. Like Thinking in Bets was really fun. One of the books that's really got me thinking about just the world in general is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmer. She's a Native American scientist here, and she just does this wonderful job showing how Native indigenous knowledge across eons is now being proven by science to be, very effective and accurate. But the history is sort of like, oh, well, that's just, your stories you're telling.
Praying to the gods.
Yeah, so very, easy to discount when it's like the Western scientific method kind of going, well, hold on a second. But so she's done a great job showing how weaving them together is very generative. And that's made me think a lot about ways to think about sort of like science education, science awareness, and just getting people more interested in like the wonder of what's going on around us, as opposed to the, sometimes it's like STEM and you have to get a job, and that's all true and all good, but it's also just like, this can crack open the world on how we live in a crazy, amazing place. And there's so much we don't know. Our whole lives could be filled with, understanding things better.
Drew, what would you say is your superpower? A thing that you do at least better than most other people?
Ooh. Well, I'll give two answers. We were joking because one time we were at something, we were like, okay, and somebody said my superpower would be, they gave me the name Relax Man. Like, you'd be Relax Man because you calm everybody down. You're just your presence. And we were joking. He's like, and and I think that is true. Like in situations where, because creative work can be intense, like you have a deadline and stuff like that, and people are getting together, and things aren't working, so you can feel the pressure. And so sometimes it's like, well, let's take a step back. Let's think about it. Let's work about it. It's, like you said, failure is not fatal and it's not final. But at the time you might be like, it's all over. And so like really helping people kind of just take a breath and go, I think is a big part. And then that type of like building on that a little bit more, just helping people understand how to communicate across topic areas and across discipline expertise, and even across cultural differences is something I really try to aspire to do as best as I can and do better. Like it tends, I know it surprises, we have a huge international student population at Carnegie Mellon, and a lot of the faculty work really hard to go like get their names and get their names correctly, and stuff like that. And you can tell it means so much to a student to have their name pronounced correctly and that you remember it, which I joke with them, like, here's how low the bar is. If you're just polite, you'll stand out,
Yeah.
You just be polite and be a conscientious person, and people will remember you because it's so rare.
Yeah, totally. Now we get to a difficult one, or almost last question. What would you say is your favorite game?
Whoa, all time or recently?
Your pick.
My pick was so funny because I just announced a call that like I helped. I started this journal called Well Played around the idea of like doing deep readings, as it were, deep playings of games and really analyzing the gameplay experience. And what inspired me to do that so like the latest call for the next issue of the journal is around for what we call For the Love of Games. Like, what's that game or game series or that just, is the one that got you into all of this and is like that touchstone for you, whatever that game may be. And so when I was thinking about it, it's less a game for me. God, I don't know if I have time to write this, but I hope I do. And more a mechanic. Like, I just find it fascinating, like from the inception of like Sokoban as a puzzle game that a lot of us are familiar with, pushing blocks within a physical territory that defines where you can push the block, and you have to like, therein comes all the puzzling. Like, it's a different space. You got to get the block out the door or into the chute or and I think Sokoban at first was like a warehouse type game. You're pushing crates around. And now people have just spun it out into all kinds of variants, whether it's the theming or different little tweaks in the mechanics. Like there was a great one called Red's Kingdom that's sort of like Zelda-like in its storytelling, but it's all about a kingdom of squirrels collecting the magic nuts. And it was just really cute. But then it was really kind of like had at its core Sokoban mechanics. And then similarly, I'm blanking on the name of it. Hold on, I have it on my phone. I'll tell you. Slayaway Camp. Another little sort of Sokoban-like game where you play the Freddy Krueger, and you have to maze your way through the levels in the forest to get to the campers that you're going to slay. And they do a nice thing where they kind of take the edge off the sort of like, well, hold on a sec, I'm the killer, to like, well, no, it's like, it's literally you're watching movies. Like the levels are like, pull out the VHS tape, stick it in. Now you're going into a level where you're the killer and so you're sort of like just performing a role. I thought they did some clever things to sort of mitigate like, oh, this is terribly violent, to go like, well, hold on. It's just, an homage to 80s horror movies where you're playing the role of the killer and they're all, So I got really fascinated by that. And that was something ever since I announced the call, I've been thinking about is like, could I do something where I really just unpack that mechanic and how it sort of spun out in so many different, like there's the sausage party. I think is it Steven's sausage. There's just so many that are like hard or elegant or, relaxing or, so it's just fascinating to me to think about the way something that at one point really boiled down to is just a pushing blocks mechanic with, sort of defining movement around a space to blow up into this wide variety of different types of experiences you can have.
Cool. So Drew, we're arriving to the end of the interview. Where can we find out more about you, your work, or anything else you want to say or lead us to? Yeah.
So like any curiosity about what's going on at Carnegie Mellon, the address, I'm happy to share it so you can write it out under stuff. It's etc.cmu.edu. My personal website is drew at waxeb, or is waxeb.com, WAXEB, like the moon waxes, the tide ebbs. The press I started this past year, just to this open publishing consortium. It's called playstorypress.org. All of the above are different ways. You find me, like I'm on LinkedIn. I don't do social media because I'm old. But that's
cool.
Where you can kind of find me.
Great having you around, Drew. This has been a very insightful conversation, I'm sure.
Yeah,
many of the ideas that you've spun here, a lot of the experience that you've had has inspired many of the engagers in the audience. However, Drew and engagers, as you know, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over.
Hey, engagers, and thank you for listening to the Professor Game podcast. And since you are into gamification and game-inspired solutions, how about you go into the free gamification course that we have for you? Just go to professorgame.com/free gamification course, all one word, professorgame.com/free gamification course, and get started today for free. After that, we will also be in contact and you will be the first to know of any opportunities that Professor Game might have for you. And remember, before you go on to your next mission, before you click continue, please remember to subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.